friends, welcome back to my channel. Today is the day that I've been waiting for a really long time, and that is the day that I finally finished my pair of 18th century stays. For those of you who are maybe new here and don't know what a pair of stays are, they are the 18th century precursor to what we think of now as a corset. They were basically a support garment, and they existed from the late 16th century through the late 18th century. Since I'm making an 18th century ensemble, I needed to first create a pair of stays to give my body the right shape, the right silhouette, so that when I make the other articles of clothing, it'll look correct when placed on top. I made my pair based off of an extant pair that's detailed in the Patterns of Fashion 5 book by Janet Arnold. Here is that book. And the pair that I based mine on is the 1769 Strapless Stitched Stays. It's a really pretty pair. I love the shape that it gives, and it provides a lot of flexibility in terms of, you know, it's from 1769, which is quite late in the century, but I'm not going to be making a new pair of stays for every time period within the century. If I do, you know, an outfit from the 1740s, for example, I wanted something that'll give me the basic shape, but not exactly the 1740s silhouette. So I'm going to be able to use this for the entire century. It might not be the most historically accurate, but what I go for on my channel is historical adequacy, not necessarily complete accuracy. I have some other videos where I detailed specifically how I took the pattern from the Patterns of Fashion 5 book and made it life size and then resized it to fit my body, because the original dimensions of the stays were not really to my particular proportions. So please check those out if you're at all interested. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. I really appreciate it. The first thing I did was lay out my pattern and trace it onto my fabric. I have 2 layers of a linen canvas lying on top of my table there, and I'm just drawing around the outside of my pattern pieces, giving an equal distance away from them to account for the seam allowance. Then I go through and I just trace around the actual edge of the pattern piece, making sure to leave enough space between each one of my pattern pieces. If you're wondering how I came up with the pattern pieces that I'm using, I do have a couple of videos that I made on the topic. The first where I cover how I enlarged a pattern from the Patterns of Fashion 5 book, and the second on kind of the whole mock-up process and fitting and really perfecting of the pattern before moving on to the main project here. So if you're interested in either one of those videos, I will link them in the description below, and go check those out. Next, I cut out the pattern pieces using my fabric shears. For my fashion fabric, or the outermost layer that will be visible on the stays, I'm using a heavyweight blue linen that I got from fabricstore.com, and I simply laid the lining linen pieces out on it, pinned them, and then cut around the outside. The next step was to draw in the boning pattern. I'm using 4mm wide German plastic boning for this project. I found it easiest to just draw on one line from the pattern as a starting point, sew down that line, and then use that as a guide point for the edge of my foot plate, sewing in row after row, keeping a consistent distance. That way I didn't have to worry about drawing on row after row, but could just kind of do it as I went, as I was sewing. I inserted the boning into the channels in between the two layers of linen canvas. It was sometimes difficult to get the boning to go all the way in. I think maybe I could have made the channels just a smidge wider, although I do think that because the channels were so tightly fitted to the boning, it really caused the fabric to be much smoother without any rippling. So I think that was a good effect. It was just difficult to get the boning to go in. And because that linen canvas isn't the most smooth, it would often catch in the fabric, and I would kind of have to do a lot of wiggling, pulling, tugging, you know, just generally finagling it to try and get it all the way in. I also did make sure to cut the edge of each of the boning pieces on the correct diagonal so that it would sit flush with the edge of the piece. In some places I kind of cut off little corners to try and get a more smooth rounded edge, but I didn't feel the need to file the edge down as some other people have suggested doing. I'm hoping at least that I won't regret that decision later on and that the bones won't start poking out later. When it came to sewing the pieces that have tabs, so everything except for the front pattern piece, I used the pattern and marked out where each of those tabs started and ended, and then marked any distance between them. Then when it came time to sew that part, I started up in the piece against the previous layer of stitching so that my needle could be inserted right snugly up against it, and then sewed at an angle out to leave that space to cut open the tab. Once the boning was inserted into every piece, I folded the seam allowance to the inside using quilting clips to hold it down, and then used very large whip stitches to tack it down. To join two pieces together, I put them right sides facing and then whip stitched them along the edge using a doubled strand of my waxed linen thread. Once each half was assembled, I used the same method to join the two halves together down the front center seam. This entire process was really rough on my hands. Sometimes it was difficult to get the needle to travel through all layers of the fabric. I've seen other people use these little like silicone things that you put over the tips of your fingers that help you grip the needle to pull it through more. I think if I were to do this again, I might purchase those to help alleviate some of the difficulty. The next step was to sew on the binding. This is what keeps the edges of the stays nice and neat and keeps the bones from poking through. I used chamois cloth for mine, which is a really soft leather that you can just buy off of Amazon that people typically use for detailing their cars. It's the closest that we have nowadays to the type of leather that would have been used historically to bind stays. And I found it really to be an absolute joy to work with. It is so buttery soft and smooth, and it's actually quite nice to poke the needle through it. I just really loved working with it. I need to think of more ways to incorporate chamois leather into my sewing. To prepare the stays for the binding, I cut off any excess fabric along the edges and then made sure that the bones were snugly down in each of their pockets before trimming off any excess bone. Then I laid the strip of leather against the right side of the stays and stitched it on using a back stitch with my waxed linen thread. Then I folded it over to the back side of the stays and whip stitched it down. For the corners, it was kind of hard to get all that leather to lay nicely on the back side, so I ended up cutting it down right to where the edge lied and would go over to the front. This isn't a problem because the leather isn't going to fray, so you don't have to worry about having raw edges the same way that you do with fabric. And this was also really nicely when you need to move from one piece of leather to the next, because you can simply overlay them and not have to worry about joining any edges together. I also experimented with different widths of leather strips. I started out with strips about an inch and a quarter wide, thinking that I wanted to give myself enough extra to fold over to the back. And it turned out that trying to whip stitch those down just resulted in a really kind of loose, sloppy finish that I didn't like. And because the chamois leather is very stretchy, it was actually pretty easy to work with thin strips of leather, and I ended up cutting a lot of excess off in some places, and I really like the finished product in the areas that I did that. I think it looks much neater, much cleaner. I was able to get my stitches much closer together, and the overall finished look, even though it's on the inside and no one will see it, I just think is a lot nicer that way. To cover the seams, I cut strips of leather about 1/4 inch wide and backstitched those down. At the points of the tabs on the bottom, I laid that strip over the binding, kind of as an extra way to keep the binding up snugly in the point of the tab. But on the top, I didn't want it to disrupt the nice smooth line of the binding, and so I made sure to apply that seam covering piece first before I sewed the binding on. The final step before finally being able to try this bad boy on is to do the eyelets. I'm marking my eyelet holes about 1 inch apart using a spiral lacing pattern. So if you notice on the right hand side, the eyelets that I've already sewn, the two on the bottom are actually only 1/2 inch apart. And that's so that the lacing will spiral up from the bottom. You're going to use just one single lace, not two as you would with lacing up, say, a pair of shoes. You start at the bottom and then just go back and forth up, spiraling that lace up through all the holes. I used a bone awl that I purchased from Burnley and Trowbridge to poke each one of the holes. It's basically like a pointed, graduated cylinder that allows you to spread the fibers of the fabric apart to form your hole. You don't want to punch a hole in the fabric because that's going to break the fibers and allow them to fray and just be a lot less strong than if you simply use the awl to spread the fibers apart. Then I used embroidery floss and whip stitched all around the opening. After stitching all 29 of those eyelets, I was ready to lace it up and finally try it on. So this is my first try on since I have completed the binding and the eyelets. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. I think the fit is really nice. It's really comfortable. The little tabs or points up here at the top lay nice and snugly. They don't stick out at all. They don't really impede like my arm movement at all, so that's nice. I need to probably figure out a better way to tie it because I have it like tied in the back and then the strings like brought around to the front, which it works, and you know, underneath clothes it'll all be hidden anyway, so maybe this is just what I do. But one thing that I do want to do, you can see from the side, like it's not quite all the way flat. It's almost flat because I don't really have a big chest to get in the way, but it does sort of start to like curve outward right at the bust line. I've added some reinforcements to the inside of the stays. I propped them up on these little pillows to maintain that curved shape here. And then I took some extra boning that I had. I did 3 pieces together and just tucked it in to the seam allowance. You know, followed the curve, cut it to the appropriate length, and tucked it on the other side. I used a little piece of leather here to keep it in place, and then just tacked it with thread in a couple more places. And then I also experimented with some pad stitching, it's a couture technique that's used to like give shape to garments. I don't know if it was necessarily used in stay making. I think probably not, because it didn't really do very much. But basically I needed to add another piece of linen here in the stomach area to reinforce it. So I have underneath here, you can kind of see the outline. I have another one of these boning strips that I inserted the same way. Then I put the linen down on top of it and stitched along the edge of that. And then these stitches here were my attempt at pad stitching to try and keep it in a curved shape. I think it doesn't really do much because the stays themselves are so heavy that the linen and the thread just can't really hold that shape very well. I also did kind of a similar thing. You can kind of see these rows going across like this. That's actually some smaller pad stitching that I did just on the stays themselves, just by drawing thread, you know, making tiny stitches in the hopes that it would keep it more curved. And it does help it maintain the shape a little bit, but it doesn't really do a whole lot. It doesn't do enough where I think that is really a worthwhile technique. Yeah, you can see like the little, each one of these little stitches with the thread just being drawn across and then stitched across underneath and then stitched. So yeah, but I don't think it really did that much. This is progress on adding the lining into my stays. I have whip stitched it to the top edge and partially on the bottom. Now originally I thought I was going to be able to do this all out of one piece, but I just couldn't get it to lay even remotely flat trying to do that. So I ended up cutting it there, which then I guess means I'm going to have to piece it together, which I suppose ideally I would have done before stitching it in. Now I think I'm gonna have to like just fold one side and whip stitch it down. I don't know how well that's gonna work out. Okay, I forgot to film the inside with the lining before I laced it up, and I do not feel like undoing all these laces just to film that, so I'm not going to. Here you can see where I whip stitched the 2 pieces down. Basically just whip stitched it along all sides, and it turned out pretty good.